I find myself in a car, so I do apologize for this rather sort of informal way of introducing it. First of all, welcome to everybody. It's brilliant to see so many already and many more who are joining. So that's a great sign of the fact that we pick interesting topics. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Vicky Price, the chair of the Radix Fellows, which I have been now for a little while, by which I'm delighted. And what we do, of course, is have us on top of just having produced a housing commission, which is a brilliant undertaking under the chairmanship of Kate Barker. We also, of course, hold events and have been doing quite frequent online interviews and sessions, hoping that people, not just the Radix Fellows, but also a wider audience will contribute, which is exactly what has been going on. So this one is a really interesting one, given what has been going on across the world and you know, not only in Europe, but in terms of elections. We've seen a bit of a movement to the right. Certainly, we have seen also quite a lot of polarization in terms of the way in which populist parties have gained in recognition, if you like, for the electorate. So is this a real concern? We know, of course, what's going on in the Middle East with all the concerns there. We have an election in the US. So let's see what happens. So it is particularly appropriate and topical, especially after our election here in the UK, where we seem to ostensibly move to the left, but let's see where the various policies are going to be at the end, to talk about the center. And in fact, what we are going to be doing in the next hour is we have Jo Phillips, who many of you know. She asked me not to introduce her. She might say a couple of things about herself. Interviewing Yair Zivan, who is going to talk to us about his book, The Center Must Hold. It's a book which has had contributions from 36 writers. It includes Tony Blair, Michael Bloomberg, Malcolm Turnbull, Ruth Anderson, and many more. Just a few rules. Keep your microphones off if you can. Switch your video off if you want to as well. But then do come back again with the questions. There are some questions in the chat already, which you can see and which hopefully we'll be able to cover. Buy the book afterwards. So what I may have forgotten, the other instruction to give to you, but if not, then we can go ahead. So with the interview by Jo of Yair, and let's see what happens. Thank you very much. Jo,
thank you. Thanks, Vicky. And yes, I am a familiar face to many people on these webinars and from our fabulous Radix Big Tent events over the years. And it's a huge pleasure to talk to Yair Zivan about this book. And I don't know, many of you may have had a chance to read it. You might have had a look at some of the very excellent reviews. And I suppose I should really start by asking you, Yair, why did you want to write it? Why did you, well, I mean, it's you've edited, you've collated contributions from many, many people, but what made you think now is the right time to do this?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jo, and Radix for having me on today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I guess we'll jump straight in. When my friends were young and radical, I was a centrist, and I think I had that tendency throughout my childhood and growing up. It was where I always saw myself, I think, politically. And so the book, I think, is something that's was brewing for a long time. Specifically, I started working on it in November 2022. I just finished 18 months working in the Israeli government, working for what was then called the Government of Change in Israel. It was a government that was centrist by tendency, if not all the members of it were centrist. And we lost the election in November 22. Anybody who has been in politics knows what losing an election feels like. And it was an opportunity for me to take stock, I think, of what had happened. And I really went into it with two key questions. The first was, are we different to everywhere else? Is what's just happened to us, where a centrist-leaning government was replaced by a right-wing conservative, arguably the most conservative government in our history, are we unique? And the second thing is this thing that I believe in, this idea, a coherent worldview that I can get other people to rally behind. So they were the kind of two motivations, I guess, for going into the book. And a subset of the first one, which is always important for anyone in politics, was a question that kept going round and round in my head, which is, what had we done wrong? What had we done that had led to a government that was so different to ours in tone and style and policy being chosen democratically by the public? So they were the motivations, and I started out writing obviously what I felt was centrism, and then reaching out to some of the other authors, and the book picked up from there.
Well, I mean, that takes us neatly to, I suppose, the big elephant in the room, which is what has gone wrong. Because if you think back, and I mean, this is included in the book, you've got a contribution from Tony Blair. But if you think back to the time of Blair and Clinton, Obama, Macron in France, and now you look at what is happening around the world, not just in Israel, but in America, in this country, and around Europe, you have to ask the question, has centrism failed, or have we in the centre failed to get our message across?
Well, I'd say a few things. First of all, I'm not as down on the global narrative as I think the mainstream tendency is. There are plenty of examples of success for political centrism, and part of politics is this sort of pendulum swing between different approaches to politics, and that's okay. The goal, obviously, if you're a believer in a particular political approach, is to win as often as possible in as many places as possible with as big a margin as possible. That isn't always possible. It isn't always the case, and that's okay. You have to understand that that's part of the political process. And again, there are clearly places where centrism has done well electorally, where centrists are winning. So that's just as a kind of a preface to the rest of the answer. In terms of what's gone wrong, I think it's worth focusing a minute on what it is that we're trying to argue for, to understand that. And one of the concerns that I had when I started writing this book was we maybe weren't coherent enough, clear enough, articulate enough about what it is that we believe. There's a confusion, I think, between political centrism as an approach and as a belief system, certainly as I see it, and I think as the authors in the book see it, and a political middle, an attempt to kind of find a middle point between where everybody else is. And a political middle can never work as a political idea. It doesn't hold water. You move around wherever the political winds move you to. If everybody moves to the right, you move to the right. If everybody moves to the left, you move to the left. Looking for that political middle point might bring short-term success in a particular election, but it certainly isn't a political idea, and it certainly isn't anything that's sustainable. So I think part of the issue was, are we being coherent enough, and are we being clear enough and articulate enough? The second thing is we have to catch up, which is to say there are new challenges that we're facing. The world is changing very rapidly, and people have what I think are a genuine set of concerns and grievances about the way the world is going. People are genuinely scared about social changes that are happening around them, and we need to do a better job at taking those grievances, taking those concerns seriously. That is to say, if somebody is scared that automation or artificial intelligence is going to sweep away a whole section of industry that holds up their town, that person isn't backwards or ignorant. They're expressing what is a very real problem and concern that they have to deal with. If somebody's concerned about immigration, it doesn't necessarily make them a racist. They're expressing, I think, a concern that we have to do a better job of dealing with, of understanding, of sympathizing with, and then offering better solutions for. And I don't think we've always done that as centrists, always done that well enough. I always go back to an example, and I know that it's fashionable to beat up on Emmanuel Macron, but he's won the French presidency twice from the political center. And there's this great moment there's a Netflix documentary on his first campaign. There's this wonderful moment where he goes to a factory in France. And the factory workers are very clearly Le Pen supporters. You can see that from the fact that people are shouting pro-Le Pen slogans at him. And he just stands in the courtyard of this factory talking to them. There isn't a stump speech. There isn't an attempt to convince them. There's a genuine dialogue. And it was so indicative of, I think, his first campaign of really listening to people's concerns and where they were. When you do that, and you cited some of the other people, is there anybody in political communication who doesn't remember Clinton's debate moment when he steps out in front of the podium, right? Those are the kinds of things that you do when you're genuinely connecting with people, and we need to make sure we're doing a good enough job of that. The populists, who I think are a major challenge to the things that we believe in, do that very well. Their solutions are terrible. They don't work, and they make the situation worse, and they feed off that anger rather than trying to solve it. And they feed off division rather than trying to solve it. But they certainly do a much better job at expressing, I think, a genuine concern, a genuine understanding of where people are coming from.
I think that's really interesting, because it is about communicating that something, I suppose, by its very nature is Goldilocks. It's a bit woolly. And there is a part, I think it's your introduction, where you talk about, the common sense, it makes sense, it to be centrist, but that can come across as very arrogant for the reasons that you've just explained so very well. And you're absolutely right that, many populists are extremely good communicators. And I wonder, how do we get around that by communicating something? Because being commonsensical and reasonable isn't necessarily passionate, but it should be.
So you're right that in the introduction, I warn against this idea of common sense solutions, of only we know what's right and what's sensible. So how do we do it? First of all, you just do it, right? You just show the passion, you show that you care, you show that you're as strong an advocate for what you believe in as anybody else is for what they believe in. One of the things that I give as an example is patriotism, right? I refuse to give ground to the political right on patriotism. They do not love their country more than I love my country. They are not more passionate about national values than people in the center. Likewise, I refuse to give the idea of empathy or caring for people who are worse off over to the political left as if that belongs to them. And you have to show that you care about the things that you care about just as much as anybody else does, and you're willing to fight for them. One of the problems is, like you said, this idea that maybe centrism is woolly, maybe it's always looking for kind of a middle ground, it's always looking for the kind of the lowest common denominator where we can get along. We have to get away from that. Look, there are what I call bad centrists, people who do centrism or say they do centrism, but don't do it well. And I think when that happens, you see the results, and the results are that it doesn't hold up, right? In the book, we give, and give me 2 minutes to kind of lay them out, but we give what I think are kind of 5 key pillars of what I think political centrism is. The first one is an unflinching, unwavering commitment to liberal democracy. And that's not just the idea of liberal democracy, it's not just the principle of it, it's the institutions that hold it together. It's the political culture that allows it to function. And centrists are the best fighters for that liberal democracy, which I genuinely believe is the best form of government that we have, and it's worth fighting for. And if we don't fight for it, it will come under threat from people who wish to tear it down. So a defense and a commitment to liberal democracy as a constantly improving political system is one. The second one I would highlight is equality of opportunity. This idea that says, look, the main role of government today is to give people the chance to succeed. We're not socialists. We don't believe that the outcome at the end should be the same for everyone. The goal is not equality of outcome. But nor do we believe, as I think some conservatives do, certainly some libertarians do, that you can just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, as the Americans like to say, because we understand that people start in different places. People have a very different start in life, even within the same country or within the same community. And that's why I think you see such a focus amongst successful centrists and committed centrists on issues like education, healthcare, infrastructure, prevention of crime and social disorder, because those tend to be the main places where you can give people the best possible start in life and then let them take it if they want to. And that's the second one I'd highlight. The third one is one that I mentioned briefly, but comes up, I think, for me a lot personally and in the book a lot, is this idea of liberal patriotism. The idea that we can create a strong patriotic national story that unites the majority of the public. It doesn't require us to overlook our failures or our weaknesses or the complicated bits of our history, right? And those exist everywhere in every country. But nor does it mean that we can't be proud of who we are and of what we've achieved. And you can do that in every country in a way that builds a positive story rather than a nationalist attack on others, rather than a sense of superiority over others, but a positive patriotic story that unites people. That's, I think, a second one. The third one is, the fourth one rather, that I'm sure we'll get onto more, is an attempt to reclaim a set of words, a set of concepts that have fallen out of fashion in politics, but are actually what make society function and work well. Words like moderation, pragmatism, nuance, complexity, compromise, right? The ideas that in our day-to-day life are what help us succeed in a family unit, in a team, in a company, in a community. And then when it gets to politics, they're words that people shy away from, and we shouldn't shy away from them. And if you ask where that passion is sometimes missing, sometimes we're not strong enough about saying, these are actually concepts that we believe strongly in, and they're concepts that make our society and our government and our politics better, and we should fight for them. And the last one I'll say is what we talk about in the book a lot as a balance between tensions. There are a set of tensions in running a country and running a society today, whether that's the tension between globalization and local communities, or security and civil rights, or the welfare state and free markets and innovation, or really any topic that you take, right? Those tensions, the idea of centrism is to say, it's okay that they exist. The goal is not for one side to defeat the other. It's not to say globalization is the answer and we crush the local community element of it because it's just not as important because globalization is the way forward. Or to say security is the only thing that matters, and if we have to take away people's civil rights and we have to live in a country that's not democratic, that's okay because security is the only thing that matters, and we chip away and chip away and chip away. Centrism says those tensions exist and they're good. They're positive. They help us move the issue forward and find the best way to manage it. So I think that's what we need to be articulating clearly to the public and to ourselves.
So yeah, and that comes across in it comes across right throughout the book, this whole idea of the complexity of everything and the need for pragmatism. I mean, one of the great examples is the chapter by Michael Bloomberg, and his example is about cleaning up New York's air pollution. It was data-based and it was cooperative rather than punitive, and it worked. And I think that's something where, you know, and we see it, you know, on small scale, big scale, when things work, when people bring others along with them and you work on the trade-offs. I mean, you know, an example for this country is that bringing in emission controls, if you like, on drivers in central London and other cities was seen as a war on motorists, but actually it was a war on air pollution. But that completely got lost because nobody bothered to say, hang on a minute, this is a public health measure, it's not about transport. And I think that's quite an interesting thing, which slightly brings us to the role of media and, you know, as we all know, the voracious appetite of social media and 24-hour news, and everybody's got to have an opinion. But linking, if you can just sort of bear with my rather rambling thought on this, how could the media be more sensible, more nuanced, more adult in talking about the trade-offs that exist within politics, whether it's about a budget or defence or international development or whatever it is? And the other thing is that we tend to have, and I suppose this also comes back to communication, these rather lazy labels of left or right. And if people are rejecting those labels, are they therefore looking for a greater emphasis on their own personal identity? And does that therefore mean that the centre, while it exists, it's not coalescing around all of those people who feel lost between the left and right labels?
So I think two questions there. It's really fashionable to beat up on the media, and I work with the press a lot. Sometimes it's deserved, and sometimes it's not. But I would say there's a few things. First of all, look, I come at it from the supplier side, right? From the political system side, which is to say it's our job to create compelling stories that embrace the complexity and embrace the difficulty, right? It's our job to give the media things they can talk about that are interesting, even if they're complicated, and to find the way to tell that story. It's a little bit lazy of political centrists to say, well, it's just really hard and the media's against us. It's true. It is easier to tell a simple story. It's easier to tell a story of good versus bad, David and Goliath, black and white. Those things are easier narratives. Our job is to inject something else into the conversation. And I do think, look, like with politics, most people go into media wanting to tell a good story, wanting to convey the truth to the public. I don't think most people go into media in order to be clickbait. And so we have to work on that and work through that in order to allow those stories to be told. It's difficult. But I would say the world of 24-hour news also gives us an opportunity. You can have a story on Sky or BBC News that can be 12 minutes, 13 minutes, rather than 2.5 minutes. You have in that an opportunity to tell a more complicated story if you do it in a compelling way. Now, when you connect with people, when you tell the story in a way that people feel is speaking to them, you cut through the media noise. Part of it is down to the messenger, right? It is easier to win an election if your candidate is, as in my case, I work with Yair Lapid, who had decades of TV experience and is incredibly charismatic and a great communicator. Or if your candidate is Tony Blair or Bill Clinton or Emmanuel Macron. What we have to do is find the way to win even when we don't have that candidate, even when we don't have that incredibly charismatic front person who's leading the way. But I do think it's possible to get through that with the media. In terms of individuals and the kind of disparity or the dispersion within politics, I think that's an advantage for centrism. It allows us to create a broad camp of people who want to line up around a set of values and set of principles and are willing to leave old labels behind. The truth is that those old labels don't work anymore. They don't fix the problems that people have. They don't offer solutions. One of my favorite essays in the book is by Jamie Susskind, who tries to lay out not even the answers, but a way to think about how we deal with the digital revolution that we're facing. It comes across in Tony Blair's essay as well and others. And part of that is saying, look, the old political systems that we have don't work anymore. They don't answer those questions. They don't meet those challenges. Centrism, because of its commitment to complexity and pragmatism and moderation, because it's naturally forward-looking, and I think tends to be pretty radical when it comes to issues like technology and progress, kind of economic progress and society moving forward, is the place where you can find the answers to those things. The other side of individualism, I guess, is that centrism is the place that I think provides the best answer today to some of the dangers of identity politics. We see that identity politics on the far left. People talk about kind of wokeness, but we also see it on the far right, where really all that matters is your gender, the color of your skin, maybe the kind of the upbringing that you had, and you as an individual don't fit into that. As people see themselves more as individuals, centrism offers a much better place for them. It breaks down that kind of division, I guess, that the populism tries to create of shifting us into two groups, an us and a them. You're either oppressed or oppressor. You're either an elite or you're real people. So centrism offers a place where you can answer that challenge that I think we see growing in the world today.
When we spoke before last week, one of the things that you spoke about, which I'm really interested in, is the idea that there is too much information and the focus is very much on now, and we have got maybe less appetite for historical knowledge in our search for truth. And you know, we can go down the rabbit hole of fake news and disinformation and misinformation, but that idea of too much information and needing to understand the background, I think is actually really important, and it does come across hugely in the book.
Yeah, look, I think there is younger people today. I don't know if I still class as a younger person today, but younger people today
in this group, you probably do.
All right, thank you very much. Have an incredible level of access to information that our parents or grandparents' generation didn't have. It is just all at the fingertips. The problem now is not that you don't have enough information, it's that you're overloaded with information. You don't always have the critical skills or abilities to assess it, to look at it, to analyze it, to put it into a broader context. look, if you, I'll give a very political example because I get the feeling we're in a political kind of group. If you look at the elections in the US right now, and you look at early voting numbers in a particular state, you can look at it and say, and there's a great Twitter account that those of us that are really into numbers kind of follow that posts kind of political numbers. And what you get under every single post of early voting in Georgia, early voting in Pennsylvania, is you get a set of responses straight away underneath that says, wow, this is terrible for Trump. This is terrible for Harris. The Democrats are winning. The Republicans are winning. It's a blue wave. It's a red wave. Because if you don't put those numbers into any sort of context, they don't mean anything. That is true with almost every kind of set of bits of information that you throw out there. So that context is really important. Now, one of the things that I think we will see happening is that people who are much younger, so my children's age, will be much better at sifting through all that information, knowing what's real and what's not, being able to identify things that are genuine from things that aren't genuine, to people like me and my parents, my grandparents' generation, who didn't grow up with all of that, who didn't grow up with the internet and with all of that information at their fingertips. So I think it's one of the things that will happen I hope as a kind of a natural process. But when we think about education, it's one of the things that we have to feed into our education system. My undergraduate degree was in history. I hugely believe that we can learn a lot from where we came from and from where things were and help that put into context. That isn't always possible in the kind of political media environment, but it's certainly something we should be striving for.
I actually quoted you when I was speaking at a conference on Saturday about that very optimistic note that young people today are much better at sifting through. And I would say to anybody, if you don't read any other chapter in this book, read Ruth Anderson on Václav Havel and the power of words and social media and, free speech and all of that stuff. We're going to...
Joe, if I can say one thing about that essay, actually, because I think it's a good example. One of the criticisms of centrism is, that comes up is that it's a middle way, it's an average. And Ruth's essay is, I think, as close to free speech absolutism as you can find in the world today, right? Clearly, there should be limits when it comes to, things that endanger people. But the idea that actually expanding free speech, giving people more space, is a positive. It's a good thing for people. It creates a better society. It allows us to overcome the challenges that we're facing now, rather than trying to shut down debate, is, I think, a classic centrist position. And whereas especially the right and some people on the further right try to claim the mantle of free speech, centrists have to be absolutely clear that we are the ones that fight for it and defend it. And I've said this before, the right have a kind of a tendency to talk about free speech all the way up until books they don't like, and then they start getting banned in libraries. And the left have a tendency to talk about free speech all the way up to political conferences that make them feel uncomfortable or views they don't like, and they start to shut them down. The role of centrists isn't to defend the free speech of centrists. That's easy. The role is to defend the free speech of people we don't like as well, to tell them they're wrong, to take the argument to them, to win the argument, but to allow that argument to take place. That, I think, by the way, will remove one of the big criticisms of centrism and give people something very positive to rally around.
Okay, let us move on to some questions, but I just want to make one point or get your view on this, that we tend to, certainly in the UK and probably in America and Europe, we tend to talk of the far right populists, and see them, if you like, as the threat to democracy, the danger to democracy. And I know that you feel very strongly that the far left is equally dangerous in other parts of the world that maybe don't get the same amount of coverage.
Yes, it's always a comment that angers people, because I think people are in it through their own political lens. And so it's important to clarify. There are places in the world where the far left is a much greater danger than the far right, and places in the world where the far right is a much greater danger than the far left. But the reason for the danger that comes from those extremes is the same, which is a complete rejection of liberal democracy, of the system that we live in, an attempt to tear down the system, a constant drive to divide us into good and bad groups, us and them. Those things exist on the far left and the far right. And we see it in different places as a real risk and a real challenge. That one of the essays in the book is by a Brazilian politician who was the centrist candidate in an election where Brazilians had to choose between the far-right, illiberal Bolsonaro, corrupt Bolsonaro, and the far-left, illiberal, populist, corrupt Lula. For a country the size of Brazil, both of those are a huge danger. In the end, she had to make a choice, where to put her support and which of the two was less dangerous at that moment. But it's a good example, it's a good essay to read to understand that risk can come from the extremes on both sides, really depending on where you are. And so I'm very careful not to dismiss the dangers that come from one side or the other when it comes to extremism.
Okay, let us now move to some of the questions. I don't necessarily have everybody's name, but I do in this case, which is good, jolly good, because it's Ben Rich and he's the boss. And his question is, if centrism equates to mainstream, isn't part of the problem that everyone believes that their views are the mainstream?
So I don't think centrism does equate to the mainstream. I think centrism equates to the list of kind of principles and values that I laid out. It does allow for a relatively broad tent, but it also has to put down, I think, walls. That is to say, it's not open-ended. There are people that you say, I'm sorry, even if you want to say you're a centrist because it suits your particular agenda right now, that doesn't make it so. You can't be a centrist if you're not committed to liberal democracy. You can't be a centrist if you are if you're a communist. You can't be a centrist if you are an extreme nationalist. Those things just don't go together. And so I don't know whether it's mainstream or not. I imagine in some places it's more mainstream, in some places it's less. But the goal of creating a coherent political idea around centrism is to say these are things that we believe in, not that they're in the middle of where everyone is, but they are what we believe should be at the center of politics. They should be the principles that should be at the center of politics. Now everybody else can work out where they want to be, around where we're setting the terms of the debate, where we're setting the reference points. There are some places where centrism will be the mainstream and will win elections. And there are some places where it will get pushed aside because there'll be a rise of a far right or a rise of a far left, or it'll get squeezed by the extremes. And there it has to kind of it has to fight back and do what political movements do, which is grow and strengthen and find a way to reconnect with the voters.
Okay. Debbie Simone has a question which says, do you think the potential for centrism varies by country? How big, for instance, is the Israeli appetite for centrism?
So sure. Look, I think there are places where centrism does better and where it does worse. It's not constant. It changes. There are times when centrism is on the up in some places and times when it's not. Here in Israel right now, I think is a fascinating case study. Look, we've been through the worst year in our history, our national history, our personal history. Today is the end of the Jewish festival where the terror attack of October 7th took place, lines up with the Jewish calendar today on the Jewish festival of Simchat Torah. So it's been a very, very heavy day here again. The last 2 days, we've had sirens, rocket fire, missiles fire from Lebanon. After a terror attack of that scale, after a national trauma of that scale that the Israeli public has faced, and with the ongoing hostages being held in Gaza, 101 hostages still being held in Gaza, which is at the forefront, I think, of almost every Israeli's mind, you would expect the Israeli public to shift to the right. It's what people do when they feel unsafe. There's a response, and the response is to shift to the right. You look at the polls in Israel since October 7th, and consistently, the right-wing conservative government that we have will lose the next election. They don't come close to winning a majority in any poll, in any reasonable, respectable media outlet. So what's happened is the Israeli public has said, okay, traditionally, we understand that the right can offer security, but the right failed to offer security. The other thing people often associate with the conservative right is a kind of a competence, an economic competence, a steady ship, nothing big, no major changes. Maybe they won't push forward on reforms that I really care about. All of that, the Israeli right failed to offer. And the public is saying, okay, what we want now actually is something that goes back to the government we had before, something more centrist, from the center left all the way through to the center right, but with a strong centrist approach to how to do politics. So there's an enormous appetite for it in Israel. Centrist parties or parties around the center are doing well in the polls. We'll see what happens when it comes to an actual election, obviously. But I think you see that in other places as well. That is, when the right or the left goes off too far to the fringes and fails at the basic tasks that it's meant to deliver on the basic things that the public expects from it, there is more space for a political center to come in and say, actually, maybe the big promises, the kind of simple answers that you're being offered aren't working. Here's an alternative. And the public responds to that.
Well, that takes us very neatly. Anybody would have thought you've done this before. And this is a question from Luke Simpson, who's talking really about environmental breakdown, global conflict, aging populations. The coming decades will be radically different from the easy growth and stability of the late 20th century, which I suppose is, you know, the third way as it was then. It seems inevitable, says Luke, that our political and economic models will have to change. Do you believe that centrism can offer a compelling vision of change and build the movements to deliver it?
Yes, I do. That's part of the reason why I put this book together, and why I hope there's a follow-up to it. And when people ask me what I hope comes next, it's that somebody else writes another book, and then somebody else writes another one, and someone else writes another one, and we create that kind of canon of work that we can build around and create that vision around. And so, yes, I absolutely believe that vision, that the answer to those enormous challenges that you quite rightly identifies, comes from the political center. Now, why does it come from the political center? There's a few reasons. One is because within all that change, we should be absolutely committed to strengthening the foundations. And the foundations are liberal democracy, they're the free market with social safety nets that we have in most of the Western world. Protecting those things, protecting our commitment to facts and to the scientific method as a way to progress and to learn, I think are the core that we shouldn't lose in what I think he's right in saying will be a period of upheaval and major changes. If you approach those challenges, new challenges that we don't have the answers to yet, through a lens of moderation and pragmatism, understanding the levels of complexity, understanding that it requires nuance, then you're more likely to be able to offer solutions that work. Now, there'll be moments when people will say, wait, this change is enormous, it's scary, it's huge. So I'm going to go to somebody who offers me a comfort blanket, a simple answer, an immediate fix, who tells me, I've got an answer for you and I can do it in 5 words and 240 characters. But those things won't work. And even if they're temporarily attractive to the public, to a public that may well be very shaken by the big changes around them, I believe that if centrism offers the compelling vision that it can, people will come back, and that will be where the basis of the answers come from.
Well, that's another word that comes up, or another idea that comes up quite a lot throughout the book, is compromise. Which is one of those words I think that you would put in your reclaim some of the language, along with nuance and moderation and pragmatism. And Malcolm Turnbull writes very well about this, making the point, you know, that to compromise is often perceived as weak, a political U-turn, rowing back. The electorate want clarity. And actually, maybe the electorate want to be treated like adults instead of the comfort blanket that is offered by the populists from either side.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Malcolm Turnbull's essay is fantastic on that. I say two things about compromise. The first thing is, anybody who is married, anybody who works in a team or shares a flat with somebody, compromises every single day. It is part of the way human interaction works and society works. My wife and I argue over the temperature of the air conditioning remote every single day until we find the temperature that works for us, right? Everybody has the, which TV channel are we going to watch, all the way up to how is the team going to function, all the way up through all the layers of society, except for politics. When you get to politics, if you're willing to compromise, it's because you're a traitor to the cause, because you're betraying your values, because you're weak, or because you're unprincipled. And that is where the idea of reclaiming the word compromise comes from. It says, actually, we all know we compromise every day. We know it's important. We know it works. We know it's important to how a society can function. We also need it in our political life. That's the first bit of the answer. Second bit, I would say, is we have to show leadership in that. That is to say, that compromising when you're in a position of weakness is easy. You don't have any choice. So somebody comes to you and offers you a compromise, you think that's better than nothing, and I'll take it. The key is learning to compromise from a position of strength. If I have the ability to pass a bill, if I was the Labour Party today in the UK, who can realistically pass almost any piece of legislation they decide to pass as a party today, they've got enough of a majority, they don't need anyone else. I would say to the Labour Party today, if you have to give up on 20% of what you believe in a bill, in a law that you want to pass, in a reform that you want to enact, in order to bring the Liberal Democrats and some of the Conservative Party with you, that is a compromise worth making. Why? One, because it creates more sustainable policy, because there is a broader buy-in. It doesn't feel partisan. It feels something that everybody's involved in. Two, because have the humility to understand that maybe other people have something to add to the conversation that is worthwhile. And three, because it creates a political environment that says we reward this kind of behavior. This is what we expect from our politicians. This is what our politicians deliver to us. And the next time when Labour are out of government, because that's the way politics works, 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, whatever it might be, if they've created a political environment that encourages compromise and encourages buy-in from other parties, even when you have a majority, they can hope, or at least expect, that to then be reciprocated back. So for me, the big challenge of compromise is, one, is reclaiming the word, but two, is also doing it when you're in a position of strength and you don't have to, but doing it because you believe it's the right thing.
Okay, question from Kevin Langford. Is centrism sustainable without economic growth?
I think economic growth is a target for all of us. And I don't think there are many political parties or political ideas that survive the electorate without economic growth. It's a key part of it. The essay, I think, in the book that most touches on it, by Andres Velasco, who's Director of Public Policy at LSE now, talks about the importance of economic growth. And I think centrism helps to deliver it. If you invest in the right things, if you create that equality of opportunity that allows more people to succeed, you create more opportunities for economic growth. It requires a longer term thinking, particularly in today's world. The investment that's needed in infrastructure to help society move forward, the ability to invest in education, which is a topic that comes up all the time, right? Education is one of those things where the immediate political payoff is pretty low. You don't really see the value, but you also know that it is one of the best ways for a society to progress and move forward and get stronger, is if its education system is strong and successful and reflective of the world that we live in. So I think economic growth is critical in that sense.
Well, and Patrick Thompson has asked, and I think to a certain extent you've answered it, what is the role of education in all of this?
I think it's one of the most important goals of government today, to create an education system all the way from birth through to higher education, to the university system, that creates a population, a public, that is suited to the workplace challenges that you need, that's suited to the world that we need. I think is certainly within the top 3 goals of any government anywhere in the world today. It should be an absolutely enormous focus. And look, that's one of those places where you see consistency in centrism, right? Education became kind of something that we laugh at, but it was a way of stressing in New Labour how important education was. And I think you see it come through again and again with centrist politicians that do a good job, that education takes a major priority. When Yair Lapid first came into politics as a centrist politician in 2013, he got an enormous amount of electoral success, more I think than people expected. The first 2 portfolios that he took was finance minister for himself and education minister for his number 2, as an example of how important I think education is or should be to centrist politicians.
Okay, and there is another question which I think I'm probably going to guess your answer, but I will ask it anyway on behalf of Andy Ross, who says, should Labour be more aggressive in preventing the far right from organising and spreading misinformation and hatred while it still can?
Should Labour and political centrists everywhere be aggressive in countering the far right or the far left? Absolutely. Yes, it is a key part of what we're supposed to do, is to take the fight to extremists, to explain why they're tearing society apart, why they make the situation worse, why they can't be trusted, the damage that they're doing, why they're lying to the public. We should show up misinformation wherever it's used. We should call it out, and we should be creative and catchy and media savvy in the way that we do it. Something in the wording of the question makes me slightly nervous, which is, I don't think the role of a government with a large majority is necessarily to shut down debate and to shut down places where people can have that conversation. So I'd be careful about how you approach it and how you think about it. The goal is absolutely the right goal. The methods, I think, are really important. Look, you can't ignore a political force of that nature. You can't push it away and hope it doesn't exist. You certainly can't criminalize it until it passes very extreme lines. Look, the barrier for banning somebody from running for politics should be exceptionally high. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a media responsibility as well. The British media, for example, has absolutely no responsibility to amplify extreme voices. They don't have to do that. They are perfectly within their rights to say there is a very large representative majority. You know, the number one party is clearly the Labour Party, then the Conservative Party, then the Liberal Democrats, and to give those parties more airspace because they're more representative of the main ideas, I think is perfectly legitimate as a media decision. You don't have to amplify the most extreme voices. I would just be careful about the wording and the methodology.
And I suppose this follows on. It's a question from Kevin Langford, who says, does a first past the post electoral system increase or decrease the chances? Well, you could put this to, his question is to increase or decrease the chances of extremists having power or influence. But you could put it the other way, which is, does a non-first past proportional representation increase the chances of a more centrist government?
So every country in the world has its own political system. Every democracy has its own political system with its own nuances. I don't think, look, I think our goal as political centrists is to win within the system that exists. It's no use complaining about the system and thinking how we could do better. Another one, and I'll give a UK example. And this is in no way a partisan comment. I did a wonderful event with Ed Davey when I was in London after the election. Enormously successful political campaign by the Liberal Democrats. What the Liberal Democrats did, and you know, you look at the vote share, it's not hugely different to Reform. But what the Liberal Democrats did and what Ed Davey did was say, this is how we win within a first past the post system. This is what we have to do. There are seats I'm not going to bother contesting. There's places I'm not going to bother putting resources in. Here are targets that I can win. This is how I maximize my vote share. It's the same in the US. Now, if the United States didn't have an electoral college and it was just a popular vote, the entire campaign would look different. The entire focus of politics would look different. So I think you have to win within the system that exists. The thing I say to people who push electoral reform is to be very careful what you wish for. You don't always know what the impact will be, what the focus will be. And what you certainly can't do is take a political culture that exists, scrap it entirely and bring something completely different in. It just doesn't work. There is a political tradition. There is a political heritage within a country that I think is always worth preserving, even if you can make changes along the way. Here in Israel, we have proportional representation. The electoral threshold is 3.25%. Now, do I think we should do away with proportional representation? No. Could we raise the threshold to 5%, 6%, maybe even higher? Absolutely. You can play within the system to make it more effective, to make it more representative, to make it work better. But I'd be very careful about taking a political heritage and trying to entirely replace it. And if that sounds a little bit like Edmund Burke, I think that's because he had this bit right.
Okay, right. We're getting close to the end of time, so I'm going to give you three very quick questions. One from Merlene Erneson. How can or how should centrist parties, thinkers influence international organizations? In other words, do they have power in a multipolar world? David Tyfield talks about the importance of ethics in the practice of politics, and is that crucial? And does that being explicit about this ethical dimension help or hinder? And a question that came in from Rod Rivers, who says, the centre must hold was top of my summer reading list. I ate it up, which I think could go on the back of the next edition. But says the first thing I did upon opening the book was scan the contents for any Irish names. There were none. So there's 3 questions there.
All right.
Quick as you can. Quick.
All right. Quick answers to the 3 questions. I hope you can hear me. My computer's being funny. In terms of international organizations, back in the 90s, the Third Way created their own conferences, organized together across borders, and it was incredibly successful. We should go back to doing that. Centrists have a lot of catching up to do in that sense, and it's certainly something that I'm focused on as well. When you take those principles and move them into the international community, I think you can do a lot of good, and there are places in the world where we can learn from one another. That's on the international side. On ethics, I can't actually believe we've gone through nearly an hour and I haven't mentioned it, and that's I apologize for that. It is absolutely critical. One of the things that centrists have to do is be committed to good governance and to ethics in politics, to hold ourselves to a high standard, even hold ourselves to a higher standard than others, and then meet it. It is absolutely no good declaring a commitment to things and then not standing by them. And the moment to do that is when things are difficult and when your ethics and your values are challenged. A political party that has to say, look, we have zero tolerance for corruption means even if somebody senior in your party who you really like is involved in corruption, you have to say to them, I'm sorry, the ethics of our party is such that you have to step down. The value system that we have is such that you have to step down, even though we like you, even though you've been a part of us for a while, even though you're a member of the family. There is an expectation that we set for ourselves. I think it is critical to restoring public faith and public trust in politics and in political parties, especially if we can do it and we know that other people aren't as committed to those values. The good governance thing, I will just say one other thing on, which is all the ideas, all the principles that we talked about are all good and important, but we also have to deliver. We also have to make sure when we get into government, we actually deliver on those promises to the public. That is the biggest gap, I think, between where the gap between expectation and delivery is one of the things that chips away at political credibility and political trust. The last thing, the Ireland question. So there isn't anyone, but I will give a shout out to 2 Irish figures. One is Lord Alderdice, Lord John Alderdice, who's a Liberal Democrat, member of the House of Lords, who gave me input, and I had some great conversations with him around these issues. And the second is Pascal Donoghue, who was a former finance minister, who wrote to me afterwards, wrote a very nice review of the book in the Irish Times, and then we've been in contact afterwards, and me and him have talked about how we can find something to do together. There are definitely strong centrist Irish voices, and it's one of the things that will be hopefully in some of the follow-up. We'll see that coming up.
Now, I want to ask you a sort of technical question, really, a bit of an insight. When you came up with the idea of the book, did you go out to all these people who were included, or did you then have an awful lot of people and some didn't make the cut?
No, so not everybody was able to contribute. There were some very big names who were close to contributing and then weren't able to for all sorts of reasons. And I won't name and shame them. But I will say, while I like to think that I'm a great salesperson and that's why they all wanted to be involved, I found myself time and time again pushing at an open door. They wanted to be a part of it. They believed in the idea. They realized that there was a gap and they wanted to actively be involved in it. It was actually surprisingly easy to convince the people in the book to write for the book, and that actually gave me a lot of confidence. So it was, one after the other, but really people were really keen to be involved and have been incredibly supportive afterwards as well.
So is there going to be a sequel?
Well, I don't, there'll be something, I imagine, but I don't know yet. I'm working on it.
Well, hopefully you'll come back and talk to us about it. Yair, thank you very much for sparing an hour to talk to us and answer some of the questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. Yair's book, The Centre Must Hold, Why Centrism is the Answer to Extremism and Polarisation, is out. It is an extremely good read, and it is published by Elliot and Thompson and available in all good bookshops and libraries as well. Thank you so much for your time and fascinating conversation. Thank you to everybody who's put in questions. And I'm now going to hand back to Ben.
Well, actually, you're handing back to me.
Oh, Vicky, I'm so sorry, Vicky, you're there.
That's quite okay. It's just that Ben is in Tallinn, as we said at the beginning, although he's probably around there somewhere and I can't see him. So well done. It was a brilliant discussion, and really good that so many people contributed and asked questions and they were answered so well. I've been left with a little bit of optimism at the end of that. I don't know whether everyone feels that, although, you know, there's still some huge problems out there where some of the principles outlined in the book perhaps cannot be necessarily met, but there we go. We can just hope. That's all we can do for the moment, I think, from our side, and maybe an influence. So thank you very much. I wanted to thank Radix Big Tent for organizing it all and putting it all together and running this interview and seminar podcast. It's been recorded, so people who were already signed up for it but didn't come to the actual event, weren't able to log on, are going to get a copy of that, and everyone who's come as well, I think, will again. Yes, do buy the book. It's one of the reasons why we also get so many authors who are very willing to talk to us, which is actually good news. Well, thank you very much for this, and of course to you, Joe, for conducting the interview, and Yair for giving us his time. Fascinating discussion. Thank you all for logging on, and see you all soon again. We're having more events, and there is also one with Danny Dorling in November. If you haven't seen the details yet, we'll make sure you do. So thank you very much, and do, of course, if you have the chance, contribute to Radix Big Tent. You can always do with some support from everybody. So if you feel that way inclined, please do support us. From me and Ben and Sophie and Joe, of course, who's done a great job. Very many thanks, and Yair, thank you very much, and all the very best. We look forward to the sequel.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.